What happens when curiosity goes too far? Marina, a 34-year-old woman fascinated by the unknown, visited a Russian zoo with her husband Alexei, expecting a carefree day. But in a split second, everything changed. When Marina came face to face with the zoo's majestic polar bears, a horrifying encounter ensued. Could this tragedy have been avoided? Join us as we uncover this chilling story of how a moment's misstep turned into an unimaginable disaster. On the morning of October 17, 2024, Marina, a 34-year-old Russian woman, and her husband Alexei decided to spend the day at the zoo. It was Alexei's idea, a way to break their daily routine and enjoy something lighthearted before the winter chill arrived. The crisp autumn air felt invigorating, and as they strolled through the zoo's pathways, they took their time admiring the animals. The trip was more than a relaxing outing for Marina, whose curiosity often led her toward the unfamiliar. It was another opportunity to explore and indulge her fascination with the unknown. Marina had always been like this. She was drawn to anything mysterious or dangerous from a young age, as if she was wired to push boundaries. It had helped her in life, landing her a successful career as a researcher, but it also meant she often teetered on the edge of recklessness. Her husband, Alexei, loved this about her. It was one of the many things that made her stand out. But there were times he wished she would rein it in, recognizing the fine line between curiosity and risk. Alexei feared that Marina's curiosity would one day prove more dangerous than beneficial. He couldn't even begin to imagine something bad happening to her. He simply loved her too much. They had been together for over a decade, a solid partnership built on understanding and trust. Alexei, the more cautious of the two, often gently pulled Marina back from the edge of her curiosity-driven impulses. Yet, today was one of those days when she felt free, uninhibited by the caution that often clouded everyday life. She was completely absorbed in the exhibits, intrigued by the wild, untamable creatures watching her from behind bars and glass. But it was the polar bears that truly caught her attention. She's never given the animals too much thought, but Marina started understanding their power by seeing them here. These were some of the most fearsome creatures on Earth, animals that thrived in some of the most hostile places. As they approached the enclosure, Marina stopped, mesmerized by the size and grace of the animals as they moved around their simulated Arctic habitat. A small crowd gathered around the railing. Marina instinctively wanted to get closer to the animals. She was determined to get the best view. A sign was posted, "Do not lean over the railing." But it barely registered in her mind as she stretched forward, trying to glimpse one of the bears as it lumbered toward the pool. Alexei was standing a few steps behind, glancing down at his phone, thinking about which exhibit they would visit next. It all happened in a split second that would forever haunt Alexei. Marina's foot slipped on the damp stone edge of the railing, her balance faltering. For a brief moment, her hands flailed, but there was nothing to grab onto. She tipped forward, her body plunging over the edge, and before anyone could react, she was in free fall, dropping into the enclosure below. The thud of her body hitting the ground sent shockwaves through the crowd. At first, there was silence, then gasps, and then chaos. Screams erupted as onlookers realized what had just happened. Alexei's heart stopped. He rushed to the railing, looking down in horror as his wife struggled to stand, disoriented by the fall. Initially startled by the sudden intrusion into their territory, the polar bears stood frozen for only a second. Then, instinct kicked in. Alexei screamed when he saw the nearest bear, a massive male, beginning to move toward his wife with terrifying speed. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the zoo. Stunned by the impact, Marina barely registered what was happening as the bear charged. She attempted to crawl backward, away from the looming predator, but it was too late. With a ferocious swipe of its paw, the bear knocked her to the ground, pinning her down as if she were nothing more than prey. The attack was brutal. Zookeepers and security rushed toward the enclosure, shouting and trying to distract the bears, but their efforts were futile. Primal instincts drove the animals, and Marina was in the heart of their territory. The male bear's jaws closed around her, dragging her limp body across the ground as the crowd watched in horror. There was no time, no way to intervene before the savage mauling reached its conclusion. Alexei, helpless and frozen above, could do nothing but scream her name. It was over in less than 5 minutes, but felt like an eternity. The life that had once been vibrant and curious was now gone, snuffed out in a horrific scene of violence and chaos. Emergency personnel descended into the enclosure as the bears were finally lured back into their cages. But there was no saving her. Marina was pronounced dead at the scene, her body a broken and mangled shell of the woman she had been. Alexei stood there, unable to process what had just happened. His heart shattered, his mind numb from the suddenness of it all. In the aftermath, the zoo came under intense scrutiny. Were the enclosures truly safe? Were the existing protocols enough to prevent such tragedies? Were the animals simply too dangerous to be kept in captivity? Marina's death sparked a wave of outrage across the country, with the media seizing upon the story and sensationalizing every detail. Headlines splashed across the news painted the zoo as a death trap and the polar bears as bloodthirsty killers. Photographs of the scene, blurred and grainy but still disturbingly clear, were plastered across tabloids. Some outlets speculated on whether Marina had been careless, while others focused on the bears, describing them as cold-blooded predators. The human fascination with danger, the very thing that had driven Marina toward her fatal encounter, became the focal point of a national debate on safety and responsibility. Alexei, devastated and consumed by guilt, found himself at the center of the media storm, a grieving widower thrust into the spotlight. He could barely recognize his own life. Every day, new reports emerged, each more sensational than the last, digging into every aspect of the tragedy. Reporters hounded him for statements, while internet forums buzzed with theories and blame. No one seemed to understand that this was more than just another news story. It was the tragic end of a life, the loss of someone who could never be replaced. Marina was not just a headline or a fleeting moment in the public's attention. She was Alexei's anchor, his closest companion, and the love that gave meaning to his everyday existence. Her absence left an unbearable void, an emptiness that no words or condolences could fill. For Alexei, her death was not just an event. It was the collapse of the world they had built together, a wound that time might dull but could never truly heal. Every memory of her, every place they visited, now carried the bittersweet weight of loss, a constant reminder of a life stolen too soon. It was August 2016, and Katie and Jack were finally on their honeymoon. The two newlyweds had looked forward to this honeymoon for years, even more than their actual wedding. A national park in Montana was the perfect destination for two people whose love of nature and the outdoors was at the core of their relationship. They had met 5 years earlier on a group trek organized by a local hiking club, where strangers bonded over shared challenges and scenic views. Katie had been immediately drawn to Jack's calm confidence, and by the end of that trek, their connection was undeniable. Since then, they have spent countless weekends exploring mountains, forests, and rivers together. It wasn't just a hobby. It was the foundation of their relationship. Now, as newlyweds, they had decided to make Glacier the setting for their first adventure as husband and wife. The warm summer air filled with the scent of pine, and the sound of rushing water made it feel like the world belonged to them. As they trekked the park, They reminisced about their past hikes, close calls, and deep love and trust. They had always taken calculated risks, knowing that nature, while beautiful, was also unpredictable and unforgiving. On that seemingly perfect afternoon, the lovebirds stopped for lunch near a riverbank surrounded by towering trees. The gentle rush of the water and the soft rustle of the wind through the foliage was peaceful. They felt at ease, but danger was lurking nearby. Katie and Jack had unknowingly wandered into the territory of a grizzly bear, a mother with her cubs hidden deep within the brush. It was a mistake they would never have made knowingly, but in the wild, such missteps can be fatal. The bear came out of nowhere as if it were a spirit of the forest. At first, a blur of brown fur and raw power crashed through the trees. Jack, taller and broader than Katie, instinctively stood up to face the threat, his frame the more imposing of the two. But the grizzly was not deterred. To her, he was the immediate threat to her cubs, and she charged with a ferocity that no human could match. Jack barely had time to react before the bear reached him. Her claws were like knives, tearing into Jack's shoulder and back, the force of her attack sending him crashing to the ground. He let out a cry of pain, his body writhing beneath the weight of the grizzly's massive bulk. Blood soaked into the earth as Katie watched in horror. Her mind raced and her heart pounded, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't lose him. Katie had always protected the people she loved, and Jack was everything to her. Without hesitation, she sprang into action. Scrambling to her feet, she grabbed anything she could, rocks, branches, hurling them at the bear, desperate to divert its attention. Her small form seemed insignificant compared to the towering beast, but she wouldn't stop. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, to save herself. But she couldn't. Jack's life was in danger, and she couldn't bear to watch him die. For a brief moment, the bear turned, distracted by Katie's frantic attempts to draw it away. Jack, bleeding and disoriented, managed to crawl away from the bear's reach, his body racked with pain. But Katie knew what would come next. The bear, having neutralized the larger threat, now saw her as the next obstacle to the safety of her cubs. There was no way out. The grizzly lunged at her with the same terrifying speed and strength it had shown with Jack. Katie barely had time to react before the bear's claws found their mark, slashing across her chest. She stumbled, but didn't retreat. She couldn't. This was the man she had vowed to spend her life with, and if this were the price she had to pay to save him, she would do it without hesitation. The bear's attack was relentless. Each strike was a reminder of nature's brutal power, a force far greater than any human could withstand. Katie tried to fight and hold her ground, but the grizzly's strength was overwhelming. She was knocked to the ground, and at that moment, she knew she wouldn't get back up. But in her heart, she believed she had done enough. Jack was alive, and that was all that mattered. The bear, its maternal instincts satisfied now that the perceived threats were neutralized, didn't linger. With Katie motionless and Jack no longer a danger, the grizzly slowly retreated into the brush, back to her cubs. It was over. Jack, gasping for air and barely able to move, crawled to Katie's side. Bloodied and broken, he reached out for her, his heart shattering as he realized the full weight of what had happened. She had sacrificed herself for him, the love of her life, the one person who had always stood by his side. Her eyes were closed, her body still, and the world seemed to blur around him as grief consumed him. He tried to stop the bleeding, to revive her, to do anything, but it was too late. The wilderness they had both loved had claimed her, and he was left alone in the forest's silence, with only the sounds of the river and the wind to keep him company. Katie was gone. Rescue crews arrived hours later, alerted by hikers who had heard the commotion. They found Jack barely conscious, his body battered but alive. He was airlifted to a nearby hospital, where doctors would treat his wounds. But the real scars were the ones no medical team could heal. The loss of Katie, his soulmate, the woman who had given everything to save him, was a wound that would never fully close. The bear, driven purely by instinct to protect her young, had retreated into the wilderness as quickly as she had appeared, oblivious to the devastation she had left behind. There was no malice in her actions, only survival. But that knowledge did nothing to ease the pain Jack felt as he lay in the hospital bed, replaying the events in his mind over and over, haunted by the split-second decision that had changed everything. For Jack, the outdoors would never be the same. He would carry the weight of that day with him always. The day his wife sacrificed her life to save him. Samantha had always craved adventure. At 27, she had already built a life most people could only dream of. A successful solo backpacker and blogger, her stories of wilderness exploration have attracted hundreds of thousands of readers. Her blog was filled with vivid, well-written accounts of her experiences. Many of those seeking to escape their day-to-day lives and embrace the raw beauty of nature found inspiration in Samantha's stories. She had a way with words that drew people in, making them feel as if they were right there with her, deep in the wilderness, far from civilization. On September 18, 2018, Samantha embarked on a new adventure. This time, she had taken it to the next level, a months-long trek into the heart of the Alaskan wilderness. For Samantha, this was the ultimate challenge. Alaska's vast, untamed expanse called to her a place where isolation was complete, where the elements dictated life or death. It was dangerous, but that's what she loved about it. She meticulously planned her trip, ensuring she had everything she needed for survival: food, gear, emergency supplies. But in her mind, she knew there were no guarantees out here. The wild was unpredictable. Her blog updates were steady at first, full of awe and excitement. She described her encounters with the landscape, the wildlife, and the solitude she had always appreciated. Weeks into the trek, though, the updates stopped. At first, her followers didn't notice. She had gone silent when deep in remote areas with no signal. But as the days turned into weeks, concern grew. Her elderly parents, who had always supported her adventures but were wary of the risks, began to worry when even their private messages went unanswered. It wasn't like Samantha to go completely off the grid without warning. On October 2nd, they raised the alarm. Search and rescue teams were deployed, starting with the area where Samantha had last been heard from. It was a particularly unforgiving stretch of wilderness, where the forests were dense, the rivers fast, and the wildlife roamed free. Days passed with no sign of her, and hope began to wane. Then, on the fourth day of searching every inch of the forest, a team stumbled upon her campsite. It was a chilling sight. The remains of Samantha's small tent lay torn and crumpled, the fabric shredded as if by claws. Her backpack was upended, contents scattered across the clearing, mixed with dirt and broken branches. Nearby, a fire pit, now long extinguished, hinted that she had been preparing a meal, perhaps unaware of the danger closing in. Her gear, usually so meticulously organized, was strewn about as if a struggle had occurred. Blood stained the earth near the torn tent, a sickening contrast against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. The investigators combed through the site, piecing together the grim sequence of events. Samantha was likely ambushed while resting by the river that cut through the forest near her camp. The riverbank was a common spot for wildlife, especially grizzly bears, which often came to fish or drink. Signs of bear tracks were found near the campsite, with deep imprints in the soft earth. They followed the tracks back to the tent, where the struggle had occurred. The tent was nearly flattened, evidence of a massive force that had ripped through the fabric and collapsed the structure. Samantha's camera was found near the remains of the tent, miraculously intact, but bloodied. The memory card inside revealed the last moments she had documented. Pictures of the river, her campfire, and the towering trees surrounding her. The final image was haunting. It showed the same peaceful setting, but the angle was off, as if the camera had fallen from her hand. Investigators believed she had set it down just moments before the bear attack. The tracks told the rest of the story. The bear, likely a grizzly, had approached the camp, drawn by the scent of food or perhaps simply passing through. In the isolation of the wilderness, Samantha would have had little time to react. The investigators believed that the bear saw her as a threat. It charged, tearing through the tent where Samantha had sought refuge. The campsite bore the marks of her desperate attempt to escape, with gear tossed aside and branches snapped in the chaos. But out here, in the vast Alaskan wilderness, there was no escaping a grizzly. The search teams continued to scour the area for Samantha's body, but the dense forest and harsh conditions made it difficult. Days passed, and although parts of her clothing and gear were recovered, there was no sign of her remains. The bear had likely dragged her deeper into the forest, where nature took its course. It was a devastating discovery, but wasn't entirely unexpected in such remote and wild places. As the story unfolded, it made headlines around the world. Samantha's blog, which had once been a source of inspiration and awe, was now a painful reminder of the risks inherent in solo wilderness adventures. Her followers, devastated by the news, flooded social media with messages of grief and disbelief. How could someone so experienced and prepared fall victim to such a tragic fate? Many questioned whether solo adventures, especially in places as wild and unpredictable as Alaska, were worth the risk. Others argued that Samantha had known the dangers and had chosen to face them head-on. And now, her story had become a sobering reminder of the primal danger that still existed in the world's remote corners. Her heartbroken parents expressed their hope that her death would serve as a reminder to adventurers to be cautious and respect the power of nature while pursuing their dreams. For them, Samantha's spirit would live on in the stories she had shared, but the loss was an unbearable weight that would never truly fade. It was May 2009, at a remote lumber camp deep in the forests of British Columbia. The early morning hours were usually quiet at the camp. The workers, exhausted from long days of labor, would be sound asleep in their bunks, resting before another day of hard, physical work. Surrounded by the dense wilderness, they had grown accustomed to the silence and isolation of the job. The nearest town was miles away. Nature was both an ally and an adversary, and they respected it accordingly. But something was different that morning. Unbeknownst to the sleeping men, a black bear had wandered into the camp, lured by the lingering scent of food. The camp's kitchen area, where scraps were sometimes left out, was a beacon for the bear's keen senses. Hunger drove it further into the camp, where the workers lay unaware of the danger creeping closer. It was a large bear, powerful and bold, driven by instincts that had sharpened in the harsh wilderness. And in the early morning light, it crossed a boundary no one expected. The bear moved silently at first, sniffing the air, its dark eyes scanning for an easy meal. It approached one of the workers' cabins, the faint scent of human flesh mixing with the tantalizing promise of food. The door had been left ajar, a careless mistake that would prove deadly. Inside, a worker named Tom lay asleep, oblivious to the predator just outside. He had been with the camp for years, a seasoned lumberman who knew the dangers of the wilderness well. But that night's sleep had made him vulnerable. The bear pushed its way inside, and chaos erupted in the next few seconds. Tom awoke to a nightmare. The massive animal was on him instantly, its claws raking across his body with brutal force. He barely had time to register what was happening before the pain hit, sharp, searing, and overwhelming. The bear's jaws clamped down on his arm, its weight crushing him beneath its bulk. He screamed a sound that cut through the stillness of the camp like a siren. Blood sprayed across the small cabin as the bear tore into him, driven by hunger and a violent instinct. Outside, the other workers were jolted awake by his screams. Panic spread as they realized what was happening. Bears were not uncommon in the forest, but an attack like this, so bold and brutal, was something none of them had ever experienced. Men scrambled out of their bunks, fumbling for weapons or anything they could use to defend themselves. Some ran toward the sound, while others hesitated, frozen by fear. Undeterred by the sudden movement around the camp, the bear continued its rampage. Tom's struggle was brief. The bear's claws and teeth were too much to fight off, and within minutes he was fatally wounded. His body lay still, broken and bloodied, on the floor of the cabin as the bear turned its attention to the chaos outside. In its frenzy, the bear charged out of the cabin and into the camp, attacking anyone in its path. Workers scattered everywhere, but the bear was faster and quicker than anticipated. It lunged at another man, swiping with its massive paw and sending him crashing to the ground, injured but alive. Others tried to fight back, grabbing tools, axes, and anything they could find, but it was futile. The bear was too strong, too wild, and too determined. One of the workers, a younger man named Steve, tried to get to higher ground, hoping to evade the bear's reach. But the animal's raw power was unstoppable. It knocked him down with a swipe to his leg, claws ripping through flesh and muscle. Steve screamed, clutching his leg as blood poured out, but there was nothing he could do. The bear moved on, leaving him writhing in pain on the ground. It wasn't until the foreman, Rick, armed with a rifle, appeared that the tide began to turn. He had been alerted by the noise and grabbed his gun, knowing that shooting the bear was the only way to stop it. Rick aimed, his hand shaking as he lined up the shot. The bear was still thrashing through the camp, but Rick was a seasoned hunter who knew he had one chance. He fired. The bullet hit the bear in the shoulder, and it let out a deafening roar, momentarily stunned by the impact. The animal staggered, turning toward Rick, its dark eyes filled with fury. It looked like the bear would charge again momentarily, but Rick fired a second shot before it could. This one hit the bear square in the chest, and with a final grunt it collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The camp fell into an eerie silence. The survivors, bloodied and shaken, gathered around the bear's massive body, trying to process what had just happened. The adrenaline coursing through their veins began to wear off, replaced by shock and horror. Tom was dead, Steve was severely injured, and several others bore the marks of the bear's rampage. Once a place of hard work and camaraderie, the camp now felt like a battleground. In the days that followed, the survivors struggled to cope with the trauma. Some decided to leave and look for other, safer jobs in the city, where creatures like these could never reach them. The camp's remote location, once a peaceful escape from civilization, now felt like a trap. They had always known the risks of living so close to nature, but this attack had shattered any illusions of safety. The reality of the wilderness had come crashing down on them in the most brutal way possible. The community rallied to support them, offering medical care and emotional support, but the scars ran deep. Tom's death weighed heavily on everyone, especially Rick, who couldn't shake the guilt of not getting there in time. Steve, now recovering from his injuries, would carry the physical and emotional reminders of the attack for the rest of his life. For those who survived, the camp would never feel the same. The attack had changed everything. The Davis family had spent months planning their summer camping trip in Tennessee's National Park. It was their first time camping as a family, and they were eager to experience the beauty of the outdoors. The crisp mountain air, the towering trees, and the promise of a night under the stars filled them with excitement as they set up their campsite. 9-year-old Timmy, the youngest of the family, was particularly thrilled. His curiosity and energy had made him the one most eager for this adventure. His parents loved to watch him explore the nature around him and discover more and more of the world. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the forest, The Davises gathered around their campfire to cook dinner. The sizzle of sausages on the grill and the scent of roasting marshmallows filled the air. The forest around them was alive with chirping crickets and rustling leaves. It seemed like the perfect evening, and the family was too absorbed in their meal and conversation to notice the dark shape moving silently through the underbrush. A black bear had caught the scent of their cooking. Drawn by the rich, smoky aroma of meat, it had ventured dangerously close to the campsite. Bears were common in the Smoky Mountains, but this one had grown bold, likely accustomed to the scent of human food. Without the family realizing it, the bear had crept within striking distance. It happened suddenly. One moment, the Davis family enjoyed their meal, laughing and chatting around the fire. The next, chaos erupted. The bear, driven by its powerful hunger, charged toward the campsite, its focus locked on the smallest and easiest target, Timmy. The 9-year-old had been sitting at the edge of the group closest to the food, and the bear, seeing him as vulnerable prey, lunged. The attack was swift and brutal. Before anyone could react, the bear's massive claws swiped at Timmy. The boy screamed in terror, sending chills through his parents' hearts. In an instant, the serene evening transformed into a nightmare. Timmy's parents, Sarah and Mark, rushed toward him, their instincts driving them to protect their son. But the bear was too powerful, too wild. Mark grabbed a nearby stick, waving it frantically to scare the bear off, but the animal barely flinched. It had already sunk its teeth into Timmy's small frame, dragging him away from the campsite with terrifying strength. The boy's cries grew weaker as the bear pulled him toward the tree line, his parents chasing after them in a desperate, frantic effort to save their son. Sarah panicked and hysterically screamed for help, but they were deep in the forest, miles from other campers. The bear continued its attack, its jaws clamping harder on Timmy's body. Mark struck the bear repeatedly with the stick, but it was like hitting a boulder. The bear's thick fur and muscle absorbed the blows without slowing it down. In the chaos, time seemed to stretch. Seconds felt like hours as Timmy's parents fought desperately to free their son from the bear's grip. They had never imagined that their camping trip, meant to be filled with joy and memories, would turn into a life-or-death battle against one of nature's most powerful predators. The bear's eyes, dark and unfeeling, showed no sign of relenting. Mark, growing desperate, grabbed a rock and hurled it at the bear's head. The animal finally paused, momentarily dazed, and loosened its grip on Timmy. But the damage had already been done. The boy lay motionless on the ground, his small body bloodied and eerily still. Sarah fell to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face as she cradled her son. Mark stood over them, breathing heavily, his hands shaking from adrenaline and fear. The bear retreated into the woods, leaving the devastated family behind. The silence that followed was deafening. Only Sarah's occasional wail disturbed it. Local authorities arrived hours later, alerted by Mark. The campsite was a scene of devastation. Bloodstains on the dirt, scattered food, and a family shattered by the unimaginable loss of their child. The news of the attack spread quickly. Reports of the tragedy circulated in the media, and experts weighed in on the dangers of camping in bear country. Local authorities warned all visitors about the importance of properly storing food and maintaining a safe distance from wildlife. But for the Davis family, these precautions had come too late. Stricken with grief, Mark and Sarah Davis returned home with a new purpose. Their deep and consuming sorrow turned into a fierce determination to prevent other families from experiencing the same heartbreak. They began campaigning for stronger safety measures in national parks, advocating for stricter guidelines on food storage and more frequent patrols to monitor bear activity near campsites. They also pushed for better education on wildlife safety, believing that many campers, like themselves, were unaware of how dangerous these encounters could be. Their efforts gained traction. Media outlets covered their story, spotlighting the need for more thorough safety protocols in bear country. The park authorities, pressured by public outcry, began reviewing their policies and implementing changes to ensure that visitors were better protected. But for the Davises, no reform could ever bring back their son. Peter, a renowned wildlife photographer, had spent decades capturing the raw beauty of nature, always pushing himself to get closer to the action. His passion had earned him awards and recognition. Still, his latest project brought him to the Kamchatka Peninsula, Russia. The chance to photograph the mighty brown bears during their salmon run. It was a rare spectacle, and Peter was determined to capture the perfect shot. The sky was a pale blue that morning, promising ideal conditions for photography. Peter and his assistant ventured deep into the heart of Kamchatka's wilderness. The riverbanks were alive with the sight of bears fishing, their massive forms cutting through the water with surprising grace as they scooped up leaping salmon in their jaws. Peter's heart raced with excitement. This was exactly what he had come for. He had spent hours observing the bears from a safe distance, waiting for the right moment. But as the day wore on and the light began to change, Peter's desire for the perfect shot overtook his caution. His years of experience had given him confidence, maybe too much. He edged closer to the riverbank, his camera lens trained on a massive male bear standing in the water, its fur slick with river water as it fished for salmon. This bear was larger than the others, a dominant male in its prime. Its sheer size was awe-inspiring, and Peter knew that capturing its raw power up close would make for an unforgettable photograph. But in his excitement, he overlooked one crucial detail. He had ventured into the bear's territory. The animal, focused on its meal, was suddenly aware of Peter's presence. It stopped, turning its head slowly in his direction, its dark eyes locking onto him. Peter froze, camera still in hand, but the bear had already perceived him as a threat. In an instant, the animal's demeanor shifted from calm to aggressive. With a sudden roar that echoed through the valley, the bear charged. Standing several yards away, Peter's assistant watched in horror as the massive creature barreled toward him with terrifying speed. Peter had miscalculated despite all his years in the wild and his survival training. The bear was on him before he had time to react, covering the distance between them in seconds. Peter barely stepped back before the bear's powerful claws swiped across his chest. The force of the attack was overwhelming. The bear's weight pinned him down as it lashed out again, its claws tearing through his clothing and into his flesh. Peter's camera fell from his hands, landing in the dirt beside him. The shutter clicked one last time, capturing a blurred image of the chaos unfolding. Paralyzed by fear, his assistant could only watch as the bear continued its assault. Peter's body went limp under the bear's relentless attack. The animal's claws and teeth had done irreparable damage, leaving him mortally wounded. Blood soaked the ground, mixing with the river's edge. The bear, its dominance reasserted, finally released Peter and lumbered away, disappearing back into the forest as if nothing had happened. The silence that followed was deafening. The assistant rushed to Peter's side, but it was too late. The injuries were too severe. Once filled with the excitement of the wild, Peter's eyes were now vacant, his passion for capturing nature's beauty tragically cut short by the subject he had come to photograph. Word of the incident spread quickly. Peter's death shocked the wildlife photography community and ignited a firestorm of debate. His final photographs, recovered from the scene, told the story of that fateful day. Among them were images of the majestic and powerful bear as it fished in the river. But the final photograph, a blurry shot of the charging bear, haunted those who saw it. It was a stark reminder of the fine line between admiration and danger when working in the natural world. The tragedy sparked a reevaluation of wildlife photography ethics. Peter had been one of the best, and his death raised questions about how far photographers should go in pursuit of the perfect shot. The risks of venturing too close to wild animals, especially apex predators like bears, were suddenly at the forefront of discussions. Experts weighed in on the importance of maintaining a safe distance and respecting the boundaries of wildlife. In contrast, others pointed to the increasing pressure on photographers to capture ever more dramatic images, often at the expense of their safety. Something had to change. In some parts of the world, safety protocols for wildlife photographers were reviewed and strengthened. Workshops and seminars emphasized the need for caution, and organizations began promoting using longer lenses and remote-controlled cameras to reduce the risk of close encounters with dangerous animals. Peter's death had not been in vain. It had sparked a movement toward greater safety and responsibility in wildlife photography. Peter's legacy lived on through his photographs, a body of work that captured the raw, untamed beauty of the world's most remote and wild places.